Imagine waking up around 1 in the morning, not startled by a nightmare or a sudden noise, but simply because your body was ready. In 14th century England, this was a normal part of the night. People would wake, perhaps say a quiet prayer, chat softly with a bedfellow, or tend to the fire before drifting back to sleep. This wasn't insomnia or a disorder, it was just how nights unfolded. This video explores the fascinating history of segmented sleep, also known as the first and second sleep, and what it quietly asks of the way we sleep now. Segmented sleep, or the practice of dividing the night into two distinct periods of rest, was once a widespread phenomenon across Europe. Historians refer to these periods as the first sleep and the second sleep. For centuries, this pattern was so common that it appeared in everyday language, literature, and even legal documents. The story of how this practice faded away over time reveals as much about our present-day sleep habits as it does about the medieval world. Much of what we know about segmented sleep comes from the historian A. Roger Eckertz. Through more than a decade of research, Eckertz combed through diaries, court records, medical texts, and literature from across Europe. He found over 500 references to the first and second sleep, spanning from classical antiquity to the early 19th century. His work brought this forgotten practice back into public awareness, showing that it was once a normal part of nightly life. Eckertz's findings weren't limited to one country or language. The vocabulary for segmented sleep appears in French as premier sonno, in Italian as primo sonno, and in English as first sleep and second sleep. Even a 16th century English, Latin dictionary lists first sleep as a standard entry. Court records are especially telling, with witnesses casually mentioning what they did during their first sleep or between sleeps, much like we might reference lunchtime today. While the terminology for segmented sleep is well documented, historians and sleep scientists are cautious about how universal the practice truly was. Most written records come from literate, urban, and propertied individuals. This means we know the pattern was common enough to write about, but we can't say for certain that every household in medieval Europe followed it in the same way. The evidence shows it was known and normal, but not necessarily universal. Without gas lighting or electricity, people's daily rhythms were closely tied to the sun. Many households went to bed soon after dark, sometimes as early as 9 in the evening, especially in winter. The first stretch of sleep would last several hours, carrying most people to around midnight or 1 in the morning. Then, a waking period, sometimes called the watch, would begin, lasting from 30 minutes to a couple of hours before the second sleep took over until dawn. During this waking interval, people engaged in a variety of quiet domestic activities. Some used the time for prayer and reflection, aligning with monastic traditions of nocturnal devotion. Others talked quietly with whoever shared their bed, a common practice across social classes. Some reflected on their dreams, while others performed small chores like tending the fire or checking on children. Importantly, this period was seen as ordinary, not problematic. Writers of the period often described the first sleep as the one that produced dreams worth remembering. The waking gap gave people a chance to lie quietly and think over their dreams, turning them over in their minds before returning to sleep. This reflective pause was woven into the fabric of nightly life, offering a natural space for contemplation and mental rest. What stands out in historical sources is the tone. Physicians and clergy described this waking period as entirely ordinary. There was no anxious questioning of why someone couldn't stay asleep. The waking itself wasn't seen as a problem, but simply as part of the night's rhythm. This contrasts sharply with today's tendency to worry about waking up in the middle of the night. Segmented sleep fit naturally into a world where the boundaries between night and day were less rigid. Households were smaller and darker, and beds were often shared among family members or guests. There was no single cultural expectation that a good night's sleep meant one unbroken block. The middle of the night waking had social uses, conversation, prayer, intimacy, because there was little else to do in the darkness. It's important not to romanticize the past. Nights in the medieval period were genuinely harder in many ways. Homes were cold, fire posed real safety risks, and sleep was often interrupted by illness. The poor and laboring classes had far less control over their rest than the written sources, often produced by clergy, physicians, and the wealthy, might suggest. The two-sleep pattern wasn't a wellness practice, it was simply what nights looked like before artificial light. The decline of segmented sleep closely followed the spread of artificial light. Urban elites with access to candles, and later gas street lighting, began staying up later, gradually shifting toward a single consolidated sleep period. As industrialization reorganized labor around factory shifts and clock time, the practice faded further, eventually disappearing from living memory in the industrialized world by the early 20th century. Eckertz argues that the disappearance of segmented sleep was not just a change, but a complete forgetting. Later generations who woke at 2 a.m. and lay awake assumed something was wrong, rather than recognizing this as a once normal part of nightly life. The shift to a single, unbroken night's sleep became the new default, shaped by cultural and technological changes rather than biology. In the 1990s, psychiatrist Thomas Weyer conducted a study funded by the National Institute of Mental Health. Participants were kept in prolonged darkness, mimicking pre-industrial night conditions. Remarkably, their sleep spontaneously split into two segments, with a quiet waking period in between, closely mirroring the historical pattern Eckerch had found. This experiment suggests that our bodies may still be capable of segmented sleep under the right conditions. Could some modern middle-of-the-night waking, often labeled as sleep maintenance insomnia, reflect an older biological rhythm? Or is it simply a clash between our bodies and the modern expectation of one unbroken block of sleep? This is a question raised by both historical and experimental evidence, not a diagnosis. It's important to approach this idea with curiosity, not as a reason to dismiss genuine sleep concerns. Today, many factors contribute to sleep disruptions. Screens and blue light before bed, caffeine, irregular schedules, stress, and underlying health conditions. If waking in the middle of the night is frequent and distressing, it's important to address it with a doctor. The history of segmented sleep doesn't mean modern insomnia is imaginary or that people should stop seeking help for it. What history does offer is a gentle reframe. Waking in the middle of the night may not be the strange part. The panic that often follows, checking the clock, reaching for a phone, worrying about lost sleep, might be the truly modern invention. Our ancestors simply accepted the waking interval as part of the night, using it for quiet reflection or stillness. The next time you wake at 2 a.m. for no clear reason, consider an older, well-documented alternative to panic: stillness. Instead of reaching for a screen or spiraling into worry, try lying quietly and letting your mind wander. This approach echoes the way people once navigated their nights, embracing the natural rhythm of segmented sleep. The biggest driver behind the change in sleep patterns wasn't biology, it was light. As artificial lighting became more accessible and affordable, people stayed up later, compressing the night into a single block of sleep. This cultural shift redefined what was considered normal sleep, shaping our expectations to this day. Industrialization played a major role in consolidating sleep. Factory shifts and clock time replaced the natural rhythms of sunrise and sunset. As work schedules became more rigid, the two-sleep pattern faded, and a single, uninterrupted night's sleep became the standard. This change was driven by economic and social forces, not by a sudden shift in human biology. It's important to note that most historical records about segmented sleep come from the literate and propertied classes. The poor and laboring classes had less control over their rest, and their experiences are less well documented. This reminds us that sleep patterns have always been shaped by social and economic factors, not just biology. In medieval households, sharing beds was common, even among guests. The waking interval provided a natural time for conversation and intimacy, strengthening social bonds. Without artificial light or modern distractions, these quiet moments became a valued part of nightly life. Religious writers of the period often reference the waking hour as a natural time for private devotion. Monastic traditions included nocturnal prayer at fixed hours, and ordinary people sometimes mirrored these practices in their own homes. The waking interval became a quiet space for spiritual reflection. The waking interval was also a practical time for small chores. People might tend the fire, check on children or animals, or simply get up briefly before returning to bed. These activities were woven into the fabric of nightly life, making the most of the quiet hours between sleeps. Some period writers believed that the first sleep produced dreams worth remembering, precisely because the waking gap allowed people to reflect on them. This practice of lying quietly and thinking over dreams added a layer of meaning to the night, blending rest with contemplation. Unlike today, there was no sense of anxiety about waking up in the middle of the night. Physicians and clergy described the waking period as normal, not as a problem. The question, "Why can't I stay asleep?" simply didn't exist in the same way it does now. Despite the natural rhythm of segmented sleep, nights in the medieval period were challenging. Homes were cold, fire was a constant safety concern, and illness could interrupt rest. The experience of sleep was shaped by these hardships as much as by tradition. As artificial lighting became more widespread, people began staying up later, gradually shifting toward a single block of sleep. This change started with urban elites and eventually spread throughout society, reshaping the way nights were spent. Industrialization reorganized daily life around factory shifts and clock time, rather than sunrise and sunset. This shift made segmented sleep less practical, and by the early 20th century, the practice had largely vanished from living memory in industrialized societies. As the two-sleep pattern faded, it was forgotten so completely that later generations who woke in the night assumed something was wrong with them. The expectation of one unbroken night's sleep became so ingrained that any deviation was seen as a problem, rather than a return to an older rhythm. Thomas Weir's experiment in the 1990s provided a rare glimpse into how our bodies might naturally sleep without artificial light. Participants, kept in winter-length darkness, began to sleep in two segments, separated by a quiet waking period. This mirrored the historical pattern, suggesting that segmented sleep may be a latent biological rhythm. The historical and experimental evidence raises an intriguing question. Is some modern middle-of-the-night waking a remnant of an older biological rhythm? Or is it simply a mismatch between our bodies and the demands of modern life? This is not a diagnosis, but a question worth considering as we think about what counts as normal sleep. It's important to be clear. The history of segmented sleep is not an argument against seeking help for sleep problems. Many modern sleep disruptions are caused by real factors like screens, caffeine, stress, and health conditions. If waking in the night is frequent and distressing, it's worth addressing with a doctor. The real value of this history is in offering a gentler perspective on waking in the night. Instead of panicking or reaching for a phone, consider that your body may be following a rhythm that was once entirely normal. Stillness and quiet reflection can be a healthy response, echoing the practices of our ancestors. The biggest takeaway is that what counts as normal sleep has changed before, and the main driver was not biology, but light. As artificial lighting became common, our sleep patterns shifted. This reminds us that our expectations about sleep are shaped by culture and technology as much as by our bodies. Today, the expectation of one unbroken night's sleep is so strong that any interruption feels like a failure. But history shows that our sleep patterns have always been flexible, adapting to changes in technology, work, and daily life. Perhaps it's time to rethink what we consider normal sleep. If you wake in the night, remember that panic is a modern response. For centuries, people simply accepted the waking interval as part of the night. Instead of worrying, try embracing the quiet, letting your mind wander, or simply lying still. This approach can bring a sense of calm and acceptance. The story of the two sleeps isn't a verdict on how we should sleep today. It's an invitation to consider that our sleep habits are shaped by history, culture, and technology. The next time you wake at 2 a.m., you might choose stillness over worry, knowing that this pattern has deep roots in human history. Maybe the real question is, how did people sleep differently centuries ago? But this, how much of what we call a sleep problem today is actually a light problem, a schedule problem, or an anxiety problem wearing sleep's clothes? This perspective encourages us to look beyond biology and consider the broader context of our nightly routines. The history of segmented sleep offers quiet lessons for our modern lives. It reminds us that sleep is not just a biological function, but a cultural practice shaped by the world around us. By understanding the past, we can approach our own sleep with more curiosity and less anxiety. Approaching sleep with curiosity rather than fear opens up new possibilities. Instead of seeing every waking as a problem, we can ask what our bodies and minds might need in that moment. Sometimes, the answer is simply stillness and acceptance. There is no single right way to sleep. What works for one person or era may not work for another. The story of the two sleeps is a reminder that our sleep patterns can be flexible and adaptive, shaped by the world we live in. As we navigate the challenges of modern life, it's helpful to remember that our expectations about sleep are not set in stone. They have changed before and can change again. By learning from history, we can approach our own sleep with more understanding and less judgment. Stillness in the middle of the night can be a powerful tool. Instead of fighting wakefulness, try embracing it as a natural part of the night. This approach, rooted in history, can help reduce anxiety and promote a healthier relationship with sleep. The story of the two sleeps invites us to rethink what we consider normal and healthy sleep. By understanding the history of segmented sleep, we gain a richer perspective on our own nightly routines. The next time you wake in the night, remember, you're not alone, and your body may simply be following a rhythm as old as history itself.